What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the Florida death-thrash underdogs, Solstice. Solstice are an old school death thrash band from Florida that formed in 1990. I first became familiar with them in 2016 when they were touring. They played a show in my hometown that was sparsely attended, as most shows in my hometown are. But it was kind of cool because the band almost treated it like a band practice of sorts, where there was extended pauses between songs where they would just chat with the audience, and it overall just felt kind of like a fun little hangout. Their material is also really cool. They are pretty notable for having had some pretty famous members in their lineup, particularly Rob Barrett, who would go on to be one of the guitarists of Cannibal Corpse. They also have Alex Marquez as their drummer, who has also drummed for Demolition Hammer and Malevolent Creation, along with a whole bunch of other bands. Solstice would release their debut self-titled album in 1992. Stylistically, this album is just a smashed together version of death and thrash metal. It almost feels like Demolition Hammer, but with a little bit less of a tough guy feel to it. Rob Barrett's vocals kind of have this strep throat kind of shout to it, which is not a bad approach, but I definitely do prefer the vocal performances on some of the other Solstice albums. In terms of the sound here, it's a really charging pace to a lot of these tracks. There's a lot of searing chords, a lot of groove. A lot of stuff here is the same tempo, and that does kind of give it a bit of an homogeneous feel. But I think it's not necessarily a negative when everything just works so well here. There's a lot of energy to this album. There isn't a whole lot of variety to this album, but I would say the variety there is really does stand out. Particularly the song Netherworld, which has this slow, atmospheric beginning with some keyboards and guitar solos worked in. The closing track, Aberration, is another pretty notable song. It's got like a faster pace with some tremolos worked in. Makes for a really energetic way to close the record out. I also like Survival Reaction and Cataclysmic Outburst a lot. They have a little bit more of a melodic feel at times, which is neat. The only song I don't really like is the Carnivore cover, SMD, which stands for Suck My Dick. The song just feels a little sillier than the other tracks here, and kind of at odds stylistically with the other tracks. I think a simple and punky song could have worked on this album, and it could have added some good variety, but I think an original track just would have coalesced a little better with the other songs. In terms of production, you got a nice Scott Burns production job on this, the infamous Florida death metal producer. There's some beefy and hot guitar tones, some clattering drums, a really driving bass. This album to me just sounds old school and fantastic. The solos are equally impressive here. Really melodic and really smooth. You even have some guest solos by the infamous James Murphy of Obituary and other bands. Yeah, overall, this is a really great album. It's nice and short at only 32 minutes. Definitely overshadowed a bit by other death thrash. I think you hear more people talk about bands like Demolition Hammer and Vader than you do Solstice, but I think if you're a fan of death thrash, this is an absolute must-listen. Just an absolutely great album. And I had to think a lot about which one I love the most, but I would have to say this is my favorite Solstice album overall. Following the self-titled album, Solstice would break up in 1993 and reform in 1995 without Rob Barrett and release their second album, 1995's Prey. So this overall seems to be a bit more of a low-profile release, whereas the last album was released by Century Media Records. This one did not get released by Century Media, and in fact didn't even get a vinyl release until 2016. But in my book, this is another great album. In terms of the lineup here, you have sole constant member and guitarist Dennis Munez, once again, on guitar. Alex Marquez makes a return on drums, but you have a new vocalist and guitarist, Christian Rules. He sounds a lot more pissed off than Rob's performance on the first album, and his performance here is probably my favorite vocal performance on any Solstice album. Stylistically, Prey is pretty similar to the last album, and it also carries some of my same criticisms of the last album. It's definitely homogenous. There is some variety in the songwriting, but I don't think there's as many outside-the-box moments like the Carnivore cover and the opening of Netherworld that you had on the previous album. Fortunately, I think the album does make up for that with some really great songs. Particularly the track One at a Time, which is just one of my favorite Solstice cuts. That main riff of that track is so jumpy and addictive. Close-Minded Failure has a really cool vocal hook. All Life Lost has a pretty unique riff. Denial, which is the second track here, is a real banger. The main riff of that track is so simple yet addictive. It almost sounds like Pantera trying to do death metal. The only thing is I don't really like the way that song just fades out. I kind of would have preferred maybe a different sort of ending. The title track is another good song that I like a lot. It's got some cool grooves in it, but a couple segments of that song just feel a little awkward to me. Those quibbles aside, I do definitely enjoy the production a lot here. It's got another warm, old school sound to it, even if Scott Burns did not produce this album. The bass guitar is really fat and noodling. Yeah, overall, I definitely do like this album a little bit less than the last album. In addition to my criticisms I noted earlier, it's got fewer solos than the last album, and then the closing track, Eyes See Red, just isn't particularly notable to me. I think the first album had more killer moments per minute, but I think this is just a great album nonetheless, a great death thrash album, and a must-listen for fans of the genre. And as a must-listen, it goes in the must-listen tier. Alright, so following Prey, the band would break up again in 1997, briefly reform in the year 2000, before reforming again in 2006 and releasing their third album, To Dust, in 2009. So some notable differences with this album. They had a different drummer. Alex Marquez did not appear on this album. Vocally, Christian sounds pretty different on this album too. He sounds raspier and a lot more manic. It's an okay approach, but I'm honestly not much of a fan. I like the approach he took on Prey a lot more, and I think the vocal performance here is probably my least favorite on any Solstice album. The production definitely is different than their first two albums as well. It's very loud and it's very forceful. Everything hits hard, but it feels very mechanical to me, almost cold and clattering, like getting hit in the face with a steel plate. Because of that, I think it lacks a little atmosphere as well. The riffs, I would say, are a little bit more intricate and actually less blunt than the first two albums. I think you hear that right from the opening track, Black, which has some really cool tremolo riffs going on, kind of a slow, strained portion, and then some real devastating chugs. I think it's a great song. The solos are once again fantastic on this album. Dennis, I think, is a great soloist and pretty underrated as well. There are a couple outside-the-box moments here, too, that feel a little different than anything you heard on the first two albums. The title track, for example, has this atheist-esque passage to it where you have clean picking and then some fantastic soloing. I also like Swarm, which has this atmospheric intro, although with the production job, I don't think it's as atmospheric as it might have been otherwise, and it doesn't stand out as much as it could have. Like their other albums, this is a pretty homogeneous listen. The songs have a similar tempo, a similar pace, a similar feel, and you know, while I thought the same thing about a lot of the songs on the first two albums, I think the songs here in general just aren't quite at the same level as the songs on the first two albums. The track Extremes, for example, really stood out to me the first time I heard this album, and I was like, whoa, this is super catchy. I wish the whole album sounded like this, and then I found out it was a Cynic cover, so I think when a cover is the standout track on an album, then you know maybe the songs just aren't quite up to snuff. Not saying it's a bad album, but I definitely have my criticisms of it. It's also a long album at 42 minutes, roughly 7 minutes longer than Prey and about 10 minutes longer than the self-titled album. There's just more tracks here that blend together. Some of the tracks feel a little bit more like filler. Nothing here is bad. The core sound is good, but it's definitely less enjoyable than their other stuff. Not quite at the lowest tier, and I would blast it in my car, so I will put it there. So following To Dust, Solstice would take their time, do some touring, including the tour that I saw them on, before releasing their latest album, Cast the Die, which came out in 2021. Before even talking about the music, I have to say I love the artwork on this album. It just feels straight from 1995 and just reminds me of a time when you had Sega Genesis games and Tamagotchis and everything else from the 90s. A couple changes with this album. Alex Marquez is back on drums. They got a new guitarist and vocalist, Ryan Taylor. He's a pretty young guy. He's only 25, but I think he does a great job here. He's got kind of more of a hardcore shout, which actually feels a little bit more like Rob's approach on the self-titled album, but I think I like Ryan's vocals actually a little bit more than Rob's. There's more of a thrash influence because of Ryan's vocals, particularly on the opening track, The Altruist, which kind of has a bit of a crossover feel that I really like. The production is modern, but has much less of a mechanical feel than To Dust did, which I really like. It just feels a lot more natural, and it's a much more enjoyable sound overall. Stylistically, this album is pretty much a continuation of what To Dust was doing, but I think it improves in pretty much every way. The songs here are better overall, and even the outside the box moments are better to me. In terms of great songs, look no further than the track Ignite, which has a really catchy chorus where Ryan just goes, "Ignite the sky," and then a catchy riff behind it. It's definitely something I enjoy. The title track has some really catchy riffs, and then Eyes Sewn Shut is a really standout track to me. It's got a main melodic riff that sounds pretty cool, and I would say more melodic than almost anything I've heard Solstice do before. And then later in the song, you have this slower passage with this really smooth solo that just soars over everything. It's pretty neat. The closing track, Scratch, is an excellent song. It's probably the closest the band has ever sounded to the first two albums, and they even got Rob Barrett back to do a guest performance on vocals for this track, which is really cool. In terms of some outside-the-box moments, I think Who Bleeds Whom is definitely the first track that comes to mind. The final minute of this song has some really epic chords and then a bass solo, which would normally, I think, be something strange sounding on a Solstice album, but here I think it just adds some great variety. The solos here could be, I think, the best of the band's career. Ryan and Dennis both perform solos, and they both play off each other, particularly in the title track, which has some excellent solos, as do many of the other songs here. You know, like their other albums, this is pretty homogenous. A lot of the songs have a similar feel, and there are some songs that I think don't do anything necessarily special and could be cut. This is another long album at 42 minutes, but unlike To Dust, I think this is a better front-to-back listen. And yeah, definitely an improvement over To Dust. And I'm definitely looking forward to what the band does next. Dennis has said they won't take as long to release a new album as they did with Cast the Die. But that being said, they are listed as on hold right now on Metal Archives. So I'm not sure what the future of the band holds. Hopefully we'll continue to see them touring. Hopefully we'll continue to see them release new albums, because I definitely would love to hear some more stuff from these guys. But yeah, that does it for this video, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of Solstice, how you would rank their albums. And if you like this video, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of the Italian old school heavy metal band Bulldozer. But that does it for this one, guys. I will see you next time. Stay heavy.